From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
The Biden administration is working hard to stop an escalation of the war between Israel and Hamas to other countries. As President Biden says, Israel has no choice other than to attempt to destroy Hamas in its base in Gaza. What's next in this new Middle East war? Plus, Republicans in the House of Representatives plan another vote for Speaker on Tuesday, with Ohio Representative Jim Jordan the favorite. But several Republicans suggest they will not vote for him. What's next for the Chaos Caucus? Welcome. I'm Paul Gigot with the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal here on our daily Potomac Watch podcast, and I'm here with my colleagues Kim Strassel and Kyle Peterson. Welcome to you both. Let's start with the Israel-Hamas war, which is now 10 days old, as Israel prepares for what looks to be a ground invasion of the Gaza Strip, which Hamas used as its base to launch an assault that killed more than 1,300 Israelis and at least 29 Americans, as well as other foreigners as well. And it has something like 120 captives, too, now back in Gaza. Let's listen to President Biden on 60 Minutes on Sunday talk about Hamas and whether Israel should occupy Gaza after the war.
Israel is going after a group of people who engage in barbarism that is as consequential as the Holocaust. And so I think Israel has to respond. They have to go after Hamas. Now, Hamas is a bunch of cowards. They're hiding behind the civilians. They put their headquarters where civilians are and buildings and the like. But to the extent that they can separate out and avoid, I'm confident the Israelis are going to do everything in their power to avoid the killing of innocent civilians. Hamas and the extreme elements of Hamas don't represent all the Palestinian people. And I think that it would be a mistake for Israel to occupy Gaza again. But to going in and taking out the extremists, the Hezbollah is up north, but Hamas down south is a necessary requirement.
Full-throated support for Israel from the president, clearly giving Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister, and the new unity government in Israel the green light to go after Hamas, saying they really have no choice. Welcome comments, Kyle. Last week have been some of the president's best moments on foreign policy, in my view.
I agree. I think this was a continuation of the moral clarity that he set forth in his first statement, a short speech last week. There was some reporting last week that suggested that when the draft of that speech came to Biden, it read more like the usual interagency mush. And he was the one who drew the line and said, no, we're going to speak forthrightly about this. And so I think he deserves credit for that. He also said in that interview, he was asked whether it's time for a ceasefire, and he didn't say yes. He said, I think Israel has to respond to this mass terrorist attack in some way. He was also asked whether he thinks that the right answer here is for Israel now to completely destroy Hamas. And he said yes to that. And one other thing I think he deserves credit for is he was asked about, can the U.S. do both of these things at once, providing support and aid to Israel, providing support and aid to Ukraine's defenders in the long-running now Russian invasion of that country? And he said, yes, again, he said, we're the United States of America. Of course, we can do both of these things. I think it's an important message to hear from the president to the world and also to the Congress.
The issue of civilian casualties, potential civilian casualties, as Israel moves into Gaza, assuming it does, has come to the international fore. The president saying he is confident Israel will do everything it can to avoid civilian casualties. That's, again, another statement of support that's welcome, Kim, because Israel has warned Gazans to move south of Gaza, where they're coming in the north. They've advised them to leave. Hamas is the actor that is barring them from leaving, including in some reports stealing car keys so that they can't flee in their cars. And there will be civilian casualties. And as the president suggests, it's part of their strategy, Hamas's strategy, to use civilians as human shields because they want civilian casualties as a public relations tool, a propaganda tool to stir up potential trouble in the West Bank where there are Palestinians in Israel, nearby Israel, and the propaganda war as well against Israel.
Yeah, and everybody should be exceptionally clear that if there are those civilian casualties, who is to blame, which is Hamas. And props to the president for essentially saying that, too. He said that Hamas was cowards, that they were hiding behind their civilians. And look, Israel has given a lot of opportunity here. It has held off on bombardment to give time for civilians to work their way south. The president noted that there are discussions about a humanitarian corridor. One issue here is Egypt, which has been sticking to keeping the Rafah passage in between Gaza and Egypt closed, other than the quotas that they normally take. And according to the president in that interview and other U.S. officials, there is a lot of pressure going on Egypt right now to change that state of affairs. Apparently, there has been an opening now where Americans living in Gaza are going to be given passage, although in return for humanitarian aid heading back into Gaza. There needs to be a lot more done by Egypt. They could really play a bigger role here, but the focus needs to remain on Hamas. This is not Israel's intention in any way to harm civilians. But if Hamas is indeed going to cower behind them, it's going to use them as a propaganda tool and as human shields, there's only so much Israel can do in their goal of trying to get to Hamas and get rid of the perpetrators of this attack.
The argument that Israel is engaging in what some call collective punishment by going into Gaza to clear out Hamas is really an argument for Israel not being able to defend itself, because it's an argument that says, well, we can't do anything about Hamas. You have to let them there, from which they will launch more attacks. So I think the responsibility, as you say, for civilian casualties lies with Hamas and, frankly, with the Arab countries that refuse to take some of these as refugees. Particularly Egypt could bring them in, let them go into the Sinai. There's a lot of room. The United Nations could set up refugee camps for them, at least let the women and children out. Egypt is worried about that because it worries that they'll become permanent refugee camps, and also that they might be Hamas killers who are infiltrated with the women and children and others, and that would leave them to align with the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a fundamentalist Egyptian group that shares many of the principles of Hamas. The other issue the president raised, Kyle, Gaza, and who should rule Gaza after the Israelis go in. And he says it would be a mistake to occupy Gaza. Well, you know who agrees with that? The Israelis. They don't want to occupy Gaza either. In fact, they gave it up in 2005 for precisely that reason. The Palestinians could have run the place in the best interests of the average Palestinian. Instead, Hamas won an election there, and then a year later took total control, including killing members of the Palestinian Authority, Fatah, the alternative group of Palestinians who wanted to govern the territory in a different way. I don't know the answer of who could take over Gaza. Let's say Hamas is in fact destroyed. Palestinian Authority would be the logical choice, but it's a very dangerous game if you want to do that for any leader who attempts to try to govern in ways other than Hamas and the radicals want.
That's what makes this such a wicked problem. By the way, I think that President Biden, I don't think that the Israelis need his advice on this point, so I'm not exactly sure what he was trying to accomplish. But the Israelis don't want to run that strip. They don't want that problem. The neighboring countries, the Arab countries, Egypt does not want that problem because, as you say, they're worried that those radicals and extremists would get out and get into Egypt and cause problems in Egypt. And if you let the normal self-rule happen as it has been happening, Hamas retains control in part by intimidating and threatening and killing anyone who challenges its rule, who promises a brighter, more moderate future for Palestinian self-rule in that area. And so I agree with you. It's very hard to see what an outcome would be here, because let's say Israel succeeds in destroying the current crop of Hamas leaders. Part of what Hamas does is try to radicalize the next generation. And so it is not hard to imagine the next generation of Hamas simply coming along and taking up the reins.